So, good morning, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Muslim Institute's annual Ibn Rushd lecture. My name is Asad Rehman, and I'm the director of the Muslim Institute, as well as one of the deputy editors of its quarterly Critical Muslim. There are some copies of Critical Muslim, particularly the climate issue, which you can pick up and take home with you. They'll be available at the end of the evening. So my role tonight is to introduce our speaker, Asad Rehman of War on Want, as well as our chair for the evening, Shannon Shah, who is Director of Faith for the Climate and Senior Deputy Editor of Critical Muslim. And then finally, we will have the Muslim Institute Chair of Trustees and Bureau Chief at Nature Magazine, Ehsan Masood, who will be making closing remarks. So, as you may have noticed, due to unfortunate circumstances, Asad has been unable to make it here in person. However, with the magic of technology, we have beamed him into the room. I think we've beamed him into the room. We will beam him into the room. And we hope the hastily arranged virtual experience will run smoothly and won't temper the power of his message. Because we are at the mercy of the internet, which can be a fickle friend. And actually that reminds me, perhaps I could ask you all not to try to connect to the Art Workers Guild Wi-Fi. So that's, please don't connect to the Art Workers Guild Wi-Fi, just to give us more of a fighting chance with the connection. So we've taken the precaution of bolstering the Q&A session with a panel of experts who will, together with Asad, generate what we hope will be an impassioned discussion on climate injustice. I have to say we are incredibly grateful to Shimei Safan of Wisdom in Nature, Alessandra Palange of Muslims Declare, and Moise Bohra, who is a researcher in energy systems, for stepping up and bringing their presence and expertise to the room. So it's during the Q&A session that we will take questions from the audience. So do please feel free to put your hand up at that juncture. We also hope that the conversations we begin in this room will continue over a lavish buffet supper that is being prepared for you just beyond those doors by an organization called Made Up Kitchen. Made Up Kitchen are a people's community kitchen, creating buffet banquets from food waste. And by that I mean surplus food in excellent condition, which they rescue. Yeah, I should make that clear. Which they rescue to prevent it being binned. I think it's also worth mentioning that everybody in the Made Up Kitchen team is being paid above the London living wage. And after paying staff's wages and other expenses, all the profits, they will go to the community shop that they run. So as a result of catering for this event, up to 100 bags of fresh produce will be created to feed members of the local community in Hackney, who may otherwise struggle to access nutritious meals. So it's been a few years since we last had an Ibn Rushd lecture. And I don't think I need to remind you that quite a lot has happened since some of us last gathered at this illustrious venue. So one of the aims of these lectures is to introduce and debate the relevance today of ideas and events from the past. But I think the events of the recent past, just these last couple of years actually, have prompted many of us to contemplate the precarity of our futures and the fragility of all that we take for granted, what we consider as being the so-called normal way to live life. So this massive disruption that was and still is the pandemic prompted many of us to hope that this could be a catalyst for sort of real and meaningful change. And because there have been numerous instances where seismic moments have changed the course of history. And I think some of us sort of dared hope that this would be one such moment. And I say this because ultimately pandemics are not unconnected to the climate crisis. And because the climate crisis is not unconnected to poverty and deprivation and social and political injustice. So I think in that moment of the pandemic, we thought perhaps we were finally to experience a kind of a reckoning, that would jolt us into changing the way we live our lives, perhaps to live our lives more sustainably, to put climate crisis at the top of the political agenda. Because we could see clearly that if governments and societies and individuals are compelled to act collectively in the face of perceived imminent catastrophe, they can, and they did. But actually that's not what happened, because the world didn't pause and didn't kind of bask in introspection as we hoped. I mean, okay, so, many of us did as individuals, but there was no change from those who wield power. And the pandemic as an opportunity for a new way of doing things was never realized. So workers, particularly the most disadvantaged members of society, essential workers or otherwise, they still had to continue to go to their place of employment, risking their lives or risk losing their jobs. So, this culmination of injustices, the racial inequality highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, which was triggered by the murder of George Floyd, that happened at the height of the pandemic. And it reflected the ways in which, struggles against systems of oppression, which, this is something that, Asad has often talked about, these struggles against systems of oppression, which frame the fight for social justice in grassroots movements in the global South. I think they finally informed narratives on the climate emergency within movements in the global North. So injustice, illustrated by the impact of the pandemic on the most deprived communities, mirrors the disproportionate impact of climate change upon racialized communities. So this great pause, it wasn't the great leveler we think it was. Disproportionate numbers of racialized and marginalized communities fared particularly badly. And similarly, the global South, who are the least equipped to deal with the climate crisis, as well as being the least responsible for causing it, felt the impact of the pandemic more starkly and continue to do so. So, with vaccine inequity, for example. Essentially, there just was no let up in the neoliberal structures that govern our lives, that uphold the structures perpetuating the interlinked injustices of environmental degradation, racism, and poverty that advantage only the global elite, only the few. So when billions of people around the world, they can't access drinking water, yet floods have deluged their homes, crops fail due to unseasonal weather, leaving people unable to feed themselves and their families, driving global food prices up. When conflicts are being fueled due to the scarcity of resources, then we have to confront the reality that the injustice of climate change is manifesting itself in multiple existing injustices. And that's poverty, that's racism, that's inequality. And this is the product of what Asad describes as a broken system. These are not isolated crises, these are interlinked. Local crises become global crises. And we just cannot and should not insulate ourselves from that fact. So this system, this economic model, this exacerbates climate and social injustice. We know that, but when we had the chance, there was no great reappraisal and we reverted back to the old normal, and all to the detriment of our planet. So the political and economic will is just simply not there. It's not there to steer the world on a new course to avert climate catastrophe. And I think that's why the slogan of War on Want is so resonant. Poverty is political. So why are we losing this fight against climate injustice? And what can be done to win this fight? Because it has to be won, because as the slogan goes, there is no planet B. And it's this rather heavy question that I'm going to pose today to Asad Rehman, our speaker today. Asad is the Executive Director of War on Want. He's a long-time anti-racist campaigner, social justice activist, and former head of international climate at Friends of the Earth. So Asad, why are we losing this fight? Over to you.
Well, before that, let me unpin us and pin Asad.
Is that okay? Can I start?
Oh yeah. Okay, there you are.
Thanks, Asad.
So now I get the weird thing of just looking at myself in the thing, which is always a very strange thing to do. Assalamu alaikum, sisters, brothers, friends, and greeting to all those fighting for justice. Let me also firstly apologise that I'm not there with you in person. Unfortunately, transit issues meant I haven't been able to get back to the UK in time. So a huge thank you to Samia and Shannon for their tech skills in whipping up this Zoom link so I could join you, even if only digitally. And I do look forward to being able to be there with you face-to-face at some time in the future. The next event of the Muslim Institute, because actually nourishing the mind, body and soul with these bonds of solidarity and community that we've all missed over these last couple of years is absolutely critical. Thank you also, Samia, for the very warm and introduction. Let me just quickly say a few words about War on Want if you don't know us. War on Want is an organisation that fights against the root causes of poverty, climate injustice, human rights violations. We work primarily in partnership with grassroots social movements, trade unions, workers' organisations, to empower people to fight for their rights. And we've always taken an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist position, focusing on those drivers of injustice. And we run campaigns here in the UK against those drivers, the government, big business, the powerful vested interests who underpin this dominant economic and political system. And, you know, we really believe in building the power of people and movements to deliver the change needed. And we've been going for a very long time, over 70 years. And in that time, we've been pretty much at the forefront of many of the world's major global struggles, from really being the first to a UK organisation to support anti-colonial movements right back in the 1950s, supporting anti-imperialist movement in the 70s and the 80s. Really, we launched one of the first ever campaigns to abolish what was then called Third World Debt. And today we continue to fight many of those systemic structures that create poverty and inequality. We support movements against occupation in Palestine, frontline communities resisting extractivism, those fighting for food sovereignty, workers fighting for living wages, public services, especially garment workers Bangladesh, across Asia, as well as movements of the poor fighting for the right to housing. And as Sammy said, our slogan is poverty is political, and it speaks to that belief, the radical belief that change within this neoliberal economic system that puts profit before people and planet is only possible if we collectively are that change. And over the last couple of years, we've helped found the COP26 coalition and really tried to embed the word justice into the climate movement. And so I will do a plug if you want to support it, do join us, because I think the one thing we can all recognize in this moment is there is nobody else who's coming to save us. There is no cavalry on the horizon. The only ones are us. So let me just start by saying, in honor of all of the millions of people who've been fighting for climate justice, and overwhelmingly primarily in the global south, you know, one of the key demands of those movements that I've been working with for decades is, you know, the demand that we tell the truth, right? That we join the dots between this systemic exploitation of the poorest in the world and the demands for climate justice. And our responsibility in standing in solidarity with them and being accountable to those who are on the front lines of these struggles. And the truth is, as we all know, it's the majority of the world's people facing not just one crisis, but multiple and combining crises that all amplify every existing economic, racial, and gender inequity that's been baked into these systems. And this is not just a result of decades of neoliberal policies, but in fact, if we had time, we'd talk about, how they form part of an arc of historical exploitation of people and resources that you can trace all the way back to slavery and colonialism and imperialism, right through to, of course, now the climate crisis and as Sammy said, the COVID-19 pandemic. And underpinning this, as I would always argue, is this logic of racialized capitalism that connects these different systems of oppression, and it justifies the sacrificing of people in the interest of profit. And it's important that we understand these crises, because I think they're really critical to understanding intersectionality, not as just a nice to have lens, but as a critical in both how we understand the fight for climate justice and how we respond to these moment crises. And look, it's been a long time that, for those of us who've been advocating that, it's not possible to deal with one crisis at a time. Of course, there have been some, and I would say, unfortunately, many in the environment and climate movement, for who, this is we could argue it's not just an illusion, but a luxury that only a few in the global north are able to contemplate. For people in the global south, this is a permanent crisis, and it's compounding and interconnects poverty, racism, exploitation, and it's at the heart of denying the majority of the world's people that the basics for a dignified life and, of course, to protect our planet. So when we think about these crises, and it requires, of course, this transformation intersectional framework that begins to unpick these common threads, and it then helps us identify the critical interventions that we need to be able to guarantee that dignified life, and also within the environmental limits that are imposed upon us by the climate and ecological crisis. So I want to just start, when we talk about truth and whose truth we decide to tell about these crises. And when we start with the climate crisis, I was just remembering, when I first joined the environment climate movement a couple of decades ago, after coming out of both anti-racist movements, struggles against globalization and war, and often as one of the few non-white people in the room, I always encountered this analogy, you might have heard it. We're all face the climate crisis, and we're all literally on the Titanic, and it's hit the proverbial climate iceberg. And it's true in one sense that we are all on the Titanic, but it's also true that the citizens of the North are overwhelmingly on the deck. Yeah, we're still sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra, hoping there's going to be some miraculous technological answer, while in the hold of the Titanic are, of course, the people of the global South, and increasingly now poor in the global North, were already drowning, and when they try and escape, they find that the hold is locked shut. And of course, the fact that you're all here this evening doesn't need me to tell you the realities that underpin this important discussion on climate justice. In fact, it's been a really long time since you needed to be a climate scientist to know that, of course, extreme weather and extreme injustice is devastating every corner of the world. We've seen killer floods, fires, floods, droughts, and they're ravaging the world at a scale that we were all told would only occur in decades to come after we breached the 2 degrees. And just a reminder, these are all happening at just over an average of 1 degree warming. We've seen in recent weeks a heat wave across the Indian subcontinent. I'm originally from Pakistan. Pakistan's recorded temperatures of over 50 degrees centigrade. We've had a huge heat wave across the Middle East. And now we, of course, have 40 degrees temperatures across Europe. And, last year, the world's climate scientists, they published a report on the warning of 1.5, and the warning was emphatic, right? Breach this guardrail and we would destabilize the climate to such an extent that we would trigger feedback loops beyond our control. And we've since had new IPCC reports that set out about the impacts around the world, from collapsing food production, increasing water stress, more frequent and violent extreme weather, devastating impacts on the economies of the global south that would dwarf anything that has been experienced before, whether it's been the financial crisis or the COVID crisis. And each one of these crises, rip open the glaring inequalities of poverty and injustice faced by many in the global south. We've all now heard climate scientists tell us we're in code red for humanity, and what's now stark is, and you may have heard this recently, is that, we're going to be exhausting the carbon budget for 1.5 potentially within a decade. We'll probably breach 1.5 for the first time within 5 years. And what's incredible is countries, rich countries like the UK, are still locked to this net zero 2050 when we really need to have real emission cuts by 2030. Look, states in the global south are already unable to meet the increasing costs of both adapting to this climate violence and dealing with the economic losses. The latest figures talks about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in already losses. And I just remember I was in Mozambique, and that, and it's such an illustration of this permanent crisis that the global south faces. There was a devastating cyclone, you might remember it, in 2019, and it led to 1 million of its citizens on the brink of starvation, not because of the storm itself, but because the state had been hollowed out by decades of conflict, much of it sponsored by the West. Its economy had been forced largely to rely on export-driven commodities. It was paying out 40% of its national budget to service debt burden, and it was unable to provide the most basic of services. And what had happened? Mozambique had to come to the City of London and beg for more debt-creating loans simply to feed its own people. And these multiple crises are now the new reality. We've got 1 million people on the brink of starvation in Madagascar. A couple of years ago, India's 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of fresh water. It's now predicted 40% of India's 1.2 billion people could be without access to fresh water in the coming decades. In the Caribbean, Dominica, flattened by just one storm, and that one storm led to a loss of 240% of its GDP. And so they all illustrate the existential crisis of climate is a ticking bomb that already is wiping out what little development gains there have been. And we work a lot in Sri Lanka, and it's not got much publicity here in the UK, but currently Sri Lanka is in a huge crisis, and the government is now telling its people to only eat 2 meals a day because it can no longer provide food or energy, as it's again crippled, paying out billions in debt repayments, facing incredible costs of climate. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, he wrote, and it's incredible that these words are now being written. He said, "We've created a new climate apartheid in the world, where the rich use their wealth to seek safety whilst leaving the poor to die." And this climate apartheid, we know amplifies all these existing inequities, inequalities and inequities within our economic system, and they reinforce these unequal structures of global power, and they are what is at the root cause of leaving the most vulnerable in the global south to poverty, hunger, and death. And just about now 2 months or just over 2 months ago, the latest IPCC report came out, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described it as an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And, of course, for those on the front line, this report simply reinforced what we and the movements have been saying for decades, that the idea that you can have incremental siloed climate action is failing. That delay is already meaning death. Every second counts, every degree matters. And that this crisis isn't about our children or children's children time. This crisis is about here and already about the children and the people in the global south. And it's clear we're not all in the same boat when it comes to who's responsible, who's being impacted, and in the future, who's going to be most impacted, and of course, what action is going to be taken. So I'm just going to save you, for those who haven't read the IPCC report, it's like 4,000 pages. I presume most people will never get round to it, but it is incredibly stark, right? It says half the world, that's about 3.6 billion people, already highly vulnerable to climate change. Up to 75% of the global population will be exposed to life-threatening climate conditions due to heat and humidity in the coming decades. Of the 150 biggest cities in the world, they've seen a 500% increase in extreme heat since 1980. We've now got 2.5 billion people affected by water scarcity, and that all is set to increase, of course, as temperatures increase. And our ecosystems are already at the point of no return. That when we breach the 1.5, we'll see the demise of the overwhelming majority of coral reefs, irreversible loss of glaciers. And these are all the critical ecosystems, of course, that underpin the lives and livelihoods of the poorest people, and they're everything from access to fresh water to food production. And, the IPCC also set out very clearly who's going to be the hardest hit. Said the vulnerability of people in the global south, in Africa, Central Asia, Central America, South Asia, small islands, is 15 times more vulnerable than those in rich countries. And if you read the papers at the moment, of course, there's lots of stories, not just about Ukraine, but about the fact that we're in a food pandemic, and that we're seeing the beginning of a collapse in our food production. And again, the IPCC report talked about a 10% reduction in yield of 4 major crops. And this is a world where 2 billion people already face issues of hunger. And we're now getting what is being termed the first climate famines. And, and again, 80% of that risk population overwhelmingly going to be in Africa and Asia. And that's not because we lack food. And as you said, it's incredible. We can actually feed the world 3 times over, but nearly 80% of the world is fed by small farmers on just 24% of land. The rest of land is for commodities to export to the richest countries in a food system controlled by corporate giants who are more than happy to bury a third of all the food that's produced just so that they can maintain their profits on food production. Look, it's all a horror story, right? Temperatures increase, feedback loops begin to kick in. It's equivalent to 15 years of greenhouse gas emissions, when we only have about 10 years to halve all global emissions. And as I said, what is incredible is we are not at all in any way close to cutting our emissions. In fact, we're heading to a warming of at least 2.7 degrees warming. And the UK government continues, like many corporations, continue to promote this goal of net zero by 2050. And let me just say what that means. That means basically we're calculating to overshoot all these temperatures, and then, even though nobody knows how to do it, at some point try and dial back those temperatures through carbon dioxide removals, through overwhelmingly using unproven, risky and dangerous technologies. And it just reminded me of when I was in Copenhagen in 2009. And I was listening to the chair of the G77, which is the countries of the global south. And he sat there and tears were running down his face. And he said, 2 degrees is certain death for Africa. We're being asked to sign a suicide pact, and then the money on the table won't even pay for the coffins of our people. This is climate fascism. That 1 degree for Africa, 2 degrees is suicide. And I often think about that. And just even in these last 13, 14 years, if only his voice and the voice of the global south had been listened to, and in fact they were ignored, not just by northern governments, but actually by most mainstream climate and environmental organizations. And it's stark now that things that we were once told we were being rhetorical about are now being stated by the IPCC. Vulnerability is exacerbated by inequity and marginalization, which is linked to gender, ethnicity, and income. These inequities are due to historical systems of injustice that shape the climate crisis. And what is a first for a climate report, it said these ongoing patterns of inequity are such as colonialism continuing to exist. And so we know that colonialism wasn't just an historical fact, it creates the present and shapes the future. And looking, I can just see the lovely pictures of on the wall, but it just reminded me again of that we've just also celebrated the Queen's Jubilee. And I'm sure we all saw the crown going off in its carriage, the wealth of the global south in that crown. But just of India alone, the British Raj during its occupation of India took out 48 trillion pounds from India alone. When the Brits went to India, its share of global GDP was about 24%. When it left, it was 4%. And it's not just about historically colonialism. It's shocking, but since 1980, $16 trillion have flowed in illicit capital flows from the global south to the global north, 4.5 trillion in unsustainable debt repayments. And it's said that today, for every $1 that flows from the north to the south, $24 flows the other way. I mean, the reality is, it's not that the global north is developing the global south. The global south has developed the global north and continues to do that. Look, the climate scientists have also said very clearly, the world we live in today is not the world we will live in 10 or 20 years, and that we have a rapidly closing window of an opportunity to secure a sustainable and livable future for us all. But what kind of future is that? Well, I presume most people have probably seen that very famous champagne glass now, right? The famous, 10% of the world's population, overwhelmingly in rich countries of the North, are responsible for 50% of emissions. And the top 1% now emit 7 times that of the poorest half the world combined. And of course, that isn't the only champagne glass. If you overlay it with income inequality, you see exactly the same pattern. In a world of incredible abundance, we have half the world living on the equivalent of $5.50 a day. And that's not on $5.50, but it's what $5.50 buys you in the United States. And that's largely unchanged since 1990. And as I said, we've got 2 billion people facing hunger. We've now got 2 billion people, over 2 billion people without access to either clean water or facing water shortages. We've got about 1.6 billion people without housing, and I just could go on and on and on. And I just want to say something about poverty, because often, we're told this story about globalization has lifted billions out of extreme poverty. What they mean is $1.90, right? And let me just say, $1.90 is about just enough calories not to survive. You'd need at least $10 a day to escape poverty, $15 a day if you actually wanted to be able to feed your life, family, have a basics of your roof over your head, education. And that's not because there's not enough wealth. It's that same top 10% have amassed half of all global wealth, and the poorest 50% have about 2%. As Sammy said, this economic system isn't failing. In fact, I'd argue it's working as it was meant to, as the extraction of wealth from the poor to the rich. And if we wanted any greater illustration of that, we only have to look during COVID. The world's 2,365 billionaires saw their wealth increase by 16 trillion in 1 year alone, whilst workers in the global south lost close to 13 trillion. And we can see all of this evidence, right? So why is it, when we know this, not only are rich countries refusing to act, but actually pouring more oil and gas in the fire? I remember in November last year, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he said, we're 1 minute to midnight. Yet now the UK government is backing fossil fuel giants to make even more multi-billion pound bets on more North Sea oil and gas. And this is Exxon, Shell, BP, who made 3 trillion in profits in the last 3 decades alone. And as BP said, fossil fuels is a cash machine as they record record profits. And these carbon bombs together will emit 1 billion tons of carbon. So we all know, absolutely, there's this crisis, this intersected crisis, and it's about exploited ecosystems, resource extraction, unsustainable economic growth. So why is it in this world, well, I think partly, let me just be honest. Of course, when we look at this world, and sometimes we think about this, and I'm sure we're overwhelmed by it, right? War, inequality, climate, all these injustices, angry at governments of failures, that we feel a little bit of doom, right? And we think it's all hopeless and that there's no hope of change. And there's a sentiment, it was captured by, I don't know if you've read the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci. He said, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And it really does feel like of monsters, doesn't it? Authoritarian leaders all around the world, stoking division. We're wasting trillions on war and people unwilling to act. Are you going to tell me to shut up? I will shut up. I get 1 more minute. Are you telling me to shut up now, Samia?
Just a couple more minutes, Asad.
Okay, all right. I will literally say, look, it's exactly in this time of monsters we have to stay true to our principles of universalism and our belief that when we come together, ordinary people, we can change the world. And that's what's actually happened. Martin Luther King very famously said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Change takes a long time, but it does happen. Actually, change has always relied on us, people with the moral courage to stand up for justice and doing what was seen as unrealistic. So yes, we should feel angry about we living in a time of monsters, but it's also an incredible moment of hope. And that rests with our demands, because actually when you start to think about how to address the climate crisis, how to address the crisis of inequality, how to address the crisis of injustice and racism, you come to the same conclusions. The same demands are the ones that needed. So of course, those are living wages, social protection, public services. They're actually about making food and energy a right, so that the 500 million people who don't have access to electricity and clean cooking can have that. And this is now not just us rhetorically saying that. This is the IPCC saying, unless you have a social compact that addresses poverty and climate, we're not going to win. That we need transformational change from everything from our food to energy and transportation. So this scale, of course, needs more money than is being put forward. 100 billion that is being put forward and it's unmet by the global north. We need at least a trillion and a half. And so, again, people balk at that and then forget that we've just spent 16 trillion on COVID responses. So of course we can find money. And that means like cancellation of global debt, wealth taxes, and fixing the crisis. Look, what the major challenge for us present and the future is political will and ensuring that in this moment of doom that we counter it with a moment of hope, that cooperation and solidarity are the key. And I genuinely believe we can do that. Look, we know that what's happening now is inevitable, right? That change is going to come. The only question that is up for debate is what kind of change, who's benefiting, who'll be sacrificed. And in this struggle, we all face a choice: be on the side of monsters or be on the side of people, planet, and justice, and allow the new world we all desire to be birthed. Thank you. And apologies, Samia, for going over.
Thank you very much, Asad. I think that was very thought-provoking and impassioned lecture. I'm really grateful to you. I'm just going to hand over now to my colleague Shannon Shah, Director of Faith for the Climate and Senior Deputy Editor of Critical Muslim.
Thank you, Samia, and thank you, Asad, for that. Let me just reconfigure things for us as well. So how this is going to work is I'll spend a couple of minutes just summarizing, maybe responding to the main points in Asad's lecture. And then I'll have maybe 1 or 2 follow-up questions for him. And then after that, we'll have a quick round of questions from any of you who want to ask something directly to Asad. But don't worry, because then after that, very quickly, we will introduce our lovely panel, who will also introduce their work. These are really sterling Muslim activists based in the UK who work on climate justice. So they'll tell us a bit about their work and they'll also respond to Asad's presentation. And then we'll open it up to a wider Q&A. And then after that Q&A, I'll give Asad the last word. Asad, you can hear me properly, right? Yeah. So just to recap, the theme of our lecture today is climate justice. I mean, you would have all heard about the crisis of climate change. It's everywhere in the news agenda, especially since the UK was the host to the 26th UN climate talks last year, COP26. But there's a reason why the word justice is important. So I think what would be helpful maybe is if I distill some of the things that Asad was talking about into what I see are the 3 core themes of climate justice. So, Asad gave the example of Mozambique, a country that was nearly destroyed by a cyclone in 2019, Cyclone Idai. So Mozambique wasn't destroyed because the cyclone was so powerful. Mozambique was destroyed because this is a country that's in debt. It's not that it's poor, it's been made poor. So it has to service its debts to the global north so that when it gets hit by a cyclone like Idai, it doesn't have enough money to service its debts and deal with the aftermath of the cyclone. So people die, they get sick, they don't have enough to eat, crops fail, and so on. So that's point number 1, is to remember that those who are least responsible for causing climate change are the ones that are suffering its worst impacts. I really like Asad's analogy about the Titanic sinking. but we're not all on the same boat, right? Some of us are more affected than others. So the climate crisis has disproportionate impacts on people, but in different environments, we also have different capacities to respond. A flood that hits Germany of the same strength will have a very different impact from a flood of the same strength hitting Mozambique or Zambia for those reasons. So that's number one. The people who are least responsible for causing climate change are suffering its worst impacts. But then Asad also brings to the table an analysis of historic responsibility. He talked about the Queen's Jubilee, what the Crown has been responsible for over the last how many other centuries. So this is the crime of colonial capitalism. So the crisis that we are seeing now is not just 10 years or 20 years or 30 years in the making. It's centuries in the making. Why? Because colonialism was premised on extraction and exploitation of people's bodies, of their livelihoods, of animals, of plant life, of minerals, of fossil fuels, and so on. So there is a historic responsibility now because the countries that have benefited from this are actually the ones who are suffering the least from climate change. So this is the other aspect of climate justice. It's not just that we need to think about the people who are most disproportionately affected, but the ones who are the most disproportionately responsible and therefore have the capacity to respond and therefore have to pay a bit more than the rest of us now. And this links to the final point that Asad raised when he introduced his work with War on Want. The third element of climate justice is the climate crisis is not just a nature crisis or an environmental crisis. It has social and political causes, and it will require social and political solutions. It requires a deep transformation of our political systems, economic systems, and also the way we live our lives, right? In the rich North, how we think about the things that we eat, the transport that we use, where we take holidays and so on. These are privileges that are not enjoyed in many other parts of the world. So I think those are the three themes that I saw running from Asad's presentation, which I think you captured beautifully. I just want to ask a question now, Asad, because you mentioned the IPCC reports a few times. Now, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a panel of many, many, many experts and scientists and technical experts and so on that assess the impacts of climate change and project what's going to happen based on the scenarios we currently have. Because they're experts and scientists and because it's an intergovernmental panel, they are cautious, but they have been ringing the alarm over the decades. And in their most recent reports, they're not cautious anymore. They are talking about climate justice. This panel of cautious experts that have to serve governments are saying we need climate justice, right? But Asad, here's my question to you. Last year, the UN climate talks in Glasgow, they were to 26. The first UN climate talks were in Berlin in 1995. So we've known that there's a climate crisis looming since 1995 or even before. At the Earth Summit in Rio, we knew about this. Fossil fuel companies have known that their activities are causing climate degradation since the 60s and 70s, possibly earlier, right? But can you believe it? It's 26 COPs. That's 26 UN climate talks to solve the problem of the climate crisis. And you are saying that actually is getting worse. So my question is, yes, people power. Yes, we need to organize and transform systems. But this system of multilateralism, isn't it set up to fail in itself? So should we just, should we ditch COP, basically? It's my question to you. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the challenges of multilateralism are the same in every multilateral space, right? And it's not just the COP. At this very moment in Geneva, the World Trade Organization is meeting, and it's incredible, right? That if you remember when the pandemic started, no one is safe until everyone is safe, right? That was the mantra of every rich government. They competed with the poorest over life-saving PPE equipment. We got the vaccine, and yet 80% of the world were left unvaccinated. And since for 18 months, the countries of the global south have said, lift the waivers so we can produce vaccines cheaply. And the richest countries have basically said, no. Why? Because big pharmaceuticals are making $1,000 a second profit from the COVID vaccines, right? And they want to control that. Now, here's a thing that directly affects the health of their own citizens in the global north, because it's a pandemic and it mutates. And you know that the best solution to this is eradication, vaccinate the whole world. We could do that. It only costs tens of billions to be able to do that. We've got the technology, we've got the ability. Why aren't they doing it? So it's a question of power. And when you relate that to the climate negotiations, it's exactly the same. People look at the COP and say, why isn't it delivering? Well, because the power of the richest countries in the world block it. Governments they're not there acting rationally, that if you give them the evidence, they'll turn around and say, yes. It's a question that the global south doesn't have the same power as the richest countries. How do you change that equation of power? That's us. But we're the difference that happens. So the power we build on the outside delivers the outcomes we need on the inside. And everything we've ever won in the COP has come because movements have mobilized. The things that were happening in the COP, if we weren't there, would be even worse. And the richest countries would love not to have climate negotiations. What they want is exactly what they do in lots of other spaces. The richest countries meet together, they invite a few poor countries to join them and say, this is what we're going to do, that's your responsibility. This is the only place where we're at least, we hold them accountable. They have to be transparent about their decisions. So for me, the problem is not the COP itself. The problem is we're not powerful enough. Vested interests are much more powerful than we are, and they are the ones that influence governments to act in their interests and not our interests.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, on the record, of course, I agree with everything. I just had to ask the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
But now I'll ask the more exciting question, because you talked about people power and mobilization, and you are very centrally involved in quite a big mobilization that's going to happen in a few days, actually, on the 18th of June. I just wondered, do you want to tell people about that before I open it up to some questions?
Sure. Look, when we start from both understanding these crises, you come to, of course, the conclusion we need to be more powerful. How do we be more powerful? We need to get more people. So we know that the climate movement by itself isn't sufficient. You need to get other movements involved, and that's what we've been trying to do. Diversify the climate movement from an environmental movement to a movement of justice. So there's a logic as to why we've worked a lot with the Labour movement, etc., to bring them on board. Secondly, we know we need social license, right? To get this transformation, you need social license. You can't have people opposing. Now, you might remember a few years ago, there was a protest. It was by what was called the Yellow Vests, right? The Gilets jaunes in France. And they had a banner on their first protest, because it was against the carbon tax. It said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. And if we can't recognize that we will never get this transformation if you don't meet the material needs of people. And we're in a cost of living crisis at the moment. People are losing their way, are worried about paying bills. If you tell them, actually, what we want you to do now is hope for this new transformation, people say, well, every time there's been a transformation, we've lost. We lost in austerity, we've lost in COVID. We're going to hold on to what little we've got. So the 18th of June is the trade union movement is coming out and saying we demand better, and looking at the cost of living. As the climate justice movement, we're building a major block on that, saying actually the climate crisis is the cost of living crisis, that the crisis about energy is actually we have a solution. That would be warm homes, retrofit every home, that cut energy bills, cut energy poverty, create new jobs, and cut carbon. So it's a very different way of looking at climate and saying we're not interested in just about cutting carbon, we're interested in cutting injustice, connecting with people and building our collective power. So hopefully all of you will be on the trade union march in central London, 18th of March. Come join us on the climate justice block. We'll be there at 11 o'clock, Portland Place, outside the BBC.
Thank you so much, Asad. I'll just open it to some quick questions from the floor. And let Asad answer, and then we'll move back to the panel. Okay, I've just received instruction to go straight to the panel, Asad. So I will disappear from the screen, but hopefully you will be able to hear all of us. Oops.
Cool.
So, Asad, can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? So we now have one panel that's going to join us. May I introduce Dr. Moise Bosra? Moise Bosra. Now, let me just tell you who they are, but they will be introducing themselves more fully when we ask them, about their work. So Moise is a researcher in climate transition analytics. Alessandra is the engagement coordinator for 0 Hour, which is the campaign for a climate and ecological emergency bill. And she's also the co-founder of Muslims Declare, which is a Muslim climate justice network in the UK. And Shumesa is a core representative of Wisdom in Nature, and we're very lucky to have the core representative here as well, as I'm saying. It's an eminently qualified panel because all three have doctorates in very relevant issues. Moise's doctorate was on sustainability and the policies of the state of Qatar. Alessandra has just started her post as an honorary postdoctoral research fellow at the UCL Institute of Education, and Shumesa's PhD was on food sovereignty and community initiatives in London. I'll just let each of them tell us a bit about their work, and then they'll respond to Asad's talk for a bit. Then we'll have a Q&A, and then I'll give answers. So, Moise, let's start with you. So tell us a little bit more about yourself from what you do. How did you come to work on what you work on now?
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you to Muslim Institute for organizing the event, and thank you to Asad for just an absolutely clear message on where we are and what we need to do next. My background is in chemical engineering, and a lot of my research is focused on decarbonization of energy systems. So looking at a country level, what kind of policies, what kind of technologies need to be put in place to help countries reduce their carbon footprints, and especially focusing on the political economy of fossil fuel exporting states. So my thesis focused on Qatar specifically, to see how they might still be able to not completely evaporate in a world that no longer necessarily needs that much oil and gas. That's a little bit about me. Asad's talk was absolutely on point about all of the work that needs to be done to mobilize people to be able to fight the vested interests, which Asad you mentioned, that influence so much of policy, that influence so much of the negotiations, even at the COP, for example. And how we have the technologies in place, we have renewables that have gotten very, very cheap over the last 10 years even. How we have all of the energy efficiency technologies, insulation, extremely low-cost solutions that we can definitely implement at a national level, at an international level, with the right kind of financing that can reduce energy consumption. We also know who the biggest polluters are in society, all of the wealth inequalities that Asad mentioned. I think those are absolutely crucial points when we think about how we have targeted interventions that can reduce emissions at the national level. I'm happy to discuss further.
Thanks so much. Let me just, before I move on to so I'll just ask a quick follow-up questions for you now. By the way, when Moise was doing his PhD, he wrote a fantastic article for a climate issue of critical Muslim on gas flaring in Qatar. So, and we have other issues where we talk about climate and environment. It's our nature issue, our bodies issue, our futures issue. But the climate issue is where we dedicate the full issue to climate, and Moise's contribution is in it. Now, Moise, you mentioned the phrase vested interests. your essay was on Qatar, your PhD was on Qatar. I mean, one of the things you mentioned in your essay is these Gulf monarchies, their existence as modern nation states is intrinsically tied to fossil fuel extraction. They would not be nation states if not for fossil fuels, right? And we also know that a lot of these governments perpetrate horrendous human rights abuses. Just think of Qatar and the World Cup this year, the number of migrant workers that are dying in the stadium. Right? How do you think we can sort of marry your expertise, which is, transitions, technical solutions, with the justice element, especially for governments like Qatar and the rest of the Gulf monarchies, especially when they have such a high degree of status and respect among so many Muslims. Saudi Arabia is the guardian of the two holy shrines, but it's also one of the biggest blockers of any kind of advancement in climate negotiation.
Yeah, that's obviously a very, very important geopolitical and question from an energy point of view as well. I think these Gulf states don't operate in isolation. I think historically as well, as you mentioned, all of that development of fossil fuels in those countries occurred under like British and American oil companies. And so these industries have been supported even now with technical expertise from the West, including France, from all of the oil majors around the world have controlling often like major interests in oil and gas assets in the Gulf. The royalty payments that they receive are also then kind of funneled back into the same Western financial institutions. You look at with the Ukraine war, there was talk about Russian oligarchs owning a lot of property in London, just under them on the list, for all of the Gulf monarchies and all of the assets that honestly we don't even know the extent to which they own property and other assets here. So I don't see that in isolation. All of the human rights abuses, all of like the war in Yemen, for example, which has like fallen so far down the news cycle. All of that is facilitated and enabled by our Western democratic governments, all of the weapons sales that happen. All of these things are part of that same system. So I think there are pressure points that start from here, because often that legitimacy is being given by governments here. And that's a really key element of the challenge.
Pause for now, we'll have time for questions. I'll move on to Alessandra at the moment. Alessandra, you come with dual hats. On one hand, you work on something that's very focused on policy change at a national level for the climate and ecological emergency bill. And also your work is very much about grassroots mobilizing and organizing and inspiring Muslim communities on climate. Just tell us how you came to these sorts of dual areas of focus.
Well, I guess I work in the grassroots team. The 0 Hour campaign, which is the campaign for Ecological, has been named recently as it is introduced in the also Lords and then the Commons again. So as part of this campaign, we have branches. And what I do, or what I'm trying to do, is really communicate. I'm told very loud. So. What I'm trying to do in my work is finding ways to engage people with this proposed bill, this proposed law. So just shortly, I don't know if anybody is aware about, knows about this bill and what it does. I'll just kind of, if I don't mind, I'll introduce it quickly. So the Calamity and Ecological bill was presented first in Parliament, I think it was in 2020, by Caroline Lucas MP. And what it does, the bill does not attempt to provide, kind of concrete policies on what the government should do. It offers a framework on basically what we should achieve. So it seeks to, first of all, tackle the climate and nature crisis together, jointly. How it does that? First of all, the UK should do its fair share to cut UK emissions and stay below 1.5 of global warming, according to kind of international accords such as the Paris Agreement. So in that sense, it doesn't set arbitrary dates like 2050 that we have today, but just follow the science and do everything that is possible to stay below 1.5. And also the law, this bill would ensure that the UK should halt and reverse UK biodiversity loss by 2030. So there are very ambitious nature targets, which include not just stopping the destruction of nature, but reversing, so restoring nature on a mass scale. And taking, this is quite an important point, which I think links very well with the concept of justice. Taking responsibility, the UK should take responsibility for the entirety of its global carbon and ecological footprints, which at the moment the government calculates only for territorial emissions. And we argue that we should consider the entire carbon footprint and ecological footprint along the supply chain. So everything that we produce, including shipping and aviation, everything that we produce abroad comes to the UK. As the UK is mainly a service economy, it's quite important kind of emissions from that we create abroad, produce abroad, are very important to include. And finally, and this is very much connected to the work that I'm doing, is it asks the government to set up a climate and nature assembly, so that a group of ordinary people selected at random from the population to represent demographically the population, come together, learn from experts, and set up to get, to design an emergency strategy to get, and advise the government and parliament on the way forward. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to do with Muslims Declare as well, so my team, my colleagues are Muslims Declare, we are setting up an exhibition. We have many contacts around the world, different countries, including Nigeria, Kenya, Bangladesh, Indonesia. And what I'm working on at the moment is a traveling display of letters from ordinary people around the world, from these countries, and Morocco as well. I always forget Morocco. And what I'm trying to do with this exhibition is, one, tell the stories of these campaigners around the world. Two, I'm trying to, in digestible formats, so with an accessible language, highlight with examples, kind of mini case studies, all of the issues that Asad talked about, really, this idea of historical responsibilities, the inequalities, the fact that, as you mentioned, the poorest countries and the countries that have produced the least emissions, that have contributed the least to this crisis, are suffering the most. And we kind of give examples from different countries, from different regions. And then as we tell these stories, we ask people who want to go around the UK, in mosques, community centres, libraries, and collect stories from people as well. As they read this information, I'm very interested in having conversations with people and people communicating via letters, by video messages, their ideas, their worries, their concerns, about climate change, and we encourage people to communicate these to leaders as well, whether it's the Prime Minister or the local faith leader or someone else, some kind of business leader in the community and beyond. So in a nutshell, sorry if it was too long.
No, that's perfect.
This is what I'm working on at the moment.
No, I think that's fantastic. I just have a small follow-up question for Professor. So the UK prides itself for having a climate change act. It's one of the first governments to pass a climate change act. Now you want to push through a climate ecology bill. How does this sit with the existing climate change act? Just what are your thoughts on that?
this is an interesting question, and you catch me on something that perhaps I'm not the most qualified person to talk about that, because as I said, I work in a grassroots team, in a political team, and this bill was, written by several experts and scientists, and in a way, there's a level of trust that we put in these people. So what I said regarding this bill, I know that these are the kind of the gaps that the environmental bill does not have. So it is inadequate in relation to the scale of the problem. So this is my short, kind of unqualified answer to your question. So it's really filling the gaps that the Environment Act does not.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The fact it's called the Climate and Ecology Bill.
Is this joint report and also how we calculate emissions, and this joint effort to reach as well these ambitious targets, including the 1.5. This is something that it's not included. They use it in the 2050 target. It does not match what the scientists are saying.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move to Shamessa. Same question. Tell us a bit more about yourself and what you work on.
Okay, so going way back, I guess as a young adult, I grew up in New Jersey, and I started listening to Democracy Now!, which is a program that comes on as a response to a radio station in New York, based in New York City, that actually Asad Rehman has been among the many leaders and amazing people, which I'm not sure. But as a young adult, it exposed me to a lot of people and ideas and concepts that I wouldn't have otherwise. This is like in the prehistoric, pre-social media days. And I think that really just politicized me a bit and I guess shaped my future kind of path going forward and interest in inequalities of various kinds and different ways of addressing those and changing. And so I first worked in international health for several years on maternal and reproductive health inequality. And then, I mean, one of the struggles I had as a young person was I saw the interconnectedness of a lot of these things, like health and environment and economics, and it was difficult to pick what to do. And so I ended up going back to that school for environmental justice studies, and of course climate justice piece of that. So that's how I came to that kind of goal, environmental and climate justice. And in the States, I guess, is where that term and that movement of environmental justice came about, which is kind of the parallel over that higher level bit around disproportionate burdens that racial minorities in the North face of pollution indoor and outdoor, and in inadequate access to environmental amenities like green spaces and clean housing, quality housing, all of these things. So then climate justice, of course, came out through that too. And then while I was studying, or during my studies, I moved here, and I got involved with what was then the Responsible Network for the Environment, which is what the city used to be called. And LINE, that for short, had been involved in the climate justice arena since 2005. So starting with a stunt on Rick Wayne, wearing scuba gear to highlight the impacts on Bangladesh. And then years of going to the demos and talks and organizing actions and organizing some community since then. And so we did that for many years, and so it's really important, and really value the work that Asad, Sandra, and others are doing in the analysis that amazing people are providing. But we felt that I guess because one of our one of the things about how we worked and our approach was on the means being as important as the ends that we seek, and how we organize as a group, and we trying to hone our skills in less hierarchical ways and utilizing power in organizing and the world we wanted to like create, or that we envision as this world, as a world of justice across all of these spheres that have been talked about already. Decentralized power. Power's come up a few times on Asad's talk and my panel's talk, and so like learning to and skilling up and how to work in more decentralized ways was a really big part of what we wanted to focus on, I guess. So we shifted away from like the demos, and that wasn't the only thing we were doing climate related stuff, because I mean, Islamic perspective, we felt that everything is interconnected. So the economic, the climate and its wider ecological, the community, and all of these things are interconnected. So we shifted towards training in in group work and more consensus-based decision making, and the kinds of things that we thought are maybe increasingly useful as in the sort of new world that we want, and that's more around sharing and less concentration of power and things like that. So we shifted towards training in that side, and also in permaculture, which is a design approach to meeting humans that's based on principles of nature. And nature, of course, we're a part of it, but nature is the original kind of circular economy, and nature is always in surrender to the divine. Speaking as a Muslim, that's our kind of understanding. So there's a lot of learning that can be applied to how we set up our human systems, and whether that's around community projects or personal health or organizing, or like anything can be applied to the scale. So basically we shifted towards that. And in this Ramadan, we launched a introductory Islam and permaculture course. So we'll have more information up there on the table. But it's about trying to get these skills out to as many people as possible. And there's a lot of permaculture training, we're just weaving it in with our understanding of Islam, and again, related to all of these things. And I guess the last thing is, if I have time, is so when I think in 2009, we organized an event, or a series of events at St. Ethelbert's Center for Peace and Reconciliation. And that was how the development of that series of events was how we came to our 5-strand model of activism. And that event is called Fast for the Planet, or a series of events. And the idea was fasting is a movement away from and a movement toward. So from an Islamic perspective, it's a movement away from something we need, which is food and drink, that's essential to life. But in that movement away from, it draws us towards the divine and strengthens our spiritual being. And I think in other traditions too, that's some sort of similar concept. And so drawing on that, the power of that to facilitate a movement away from facadic culture and structure. So those that are life destroying, basically, and towards more regenerative, life affirming structures and ways of being. And so then we came out with the 5 strands, 4 of the strands of development of that, around climate justice, around whole economies, around deep democracy, and urban communities. And I won't go into all of them, because I think that's a lot. And then later on, it's the 5th strand, which was there all along, but it's around non-violent, contemplative form of activism that surrender to the divine. in all of the other strands.
Fantastic. I won't ask a follow-up question except to say that I've done the Islamic Anthropology course, and I highly recommend it. It made my Ramadan. You don't need to know what culture is. I had no idea what it was. Beautiful thing is it tells you, and it does it very well. So try it. Go to the Wisdom in Nature website. So Asad, you're back. Our panelists have shared where they're coming from. Let's open up to Q&A. We have 3 minutes for Q&A. And we'll go with Iqbal as your hand.
Thank you very much, Asad. I have 2 observations. One is that Asad mentioned, and this is quite common knowledge, that you need trillions of dollars of funding for special development. So, question is, who's going to pay for it? And one of the things which we have to do as activists here is to inform our people that we have to pay for it and why. The second one, which is critical, is that we will need to relax the protection. As you see today, the WTO is discussing even vaccines, which is such a problem. It's not accepted by the UK, especially in the United States. So I believe that these are the 2 issues we need to campaign here to get our governments and our people geared up that it's not going to be a zero sum game. We need to give up something in terms of taxes, higher taxes, or whatever it is, to get those resources to the countries. And finally, one of the campaigning points could be that our call on global ecological capital historically has been disproportionate to our numbers. We probably consumed 100 times what we should have. So we should now be able to contribute even more disproportionately. So I think that's my take on the kind of activism we need.
Shall I go to Asad? Did you get the question?
That was who's going to pay the WTO and waiver and climate. Was that right? And then I missed the last bit. It broke up a little bit. If you could paraphrase the last bit.
Basically, we need to convince people that the money needs to come from us, and how do we do that?
Okay. Yeah.
This is the global north.
Sure. Oh, do you want me to answer it, or do you want to take a few questions and I can answer them together?
You go first, and we'll handle this.
So shall I answer that one?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's a fundamental problem, and you've hit it right on the nail. And I think it's a problem about the story we tell, right? So if you tell ordinary people, who've gone through austerity, going through a cost of living, well, we are now going to have to pay. Of course, people are going to say, no way. But there is a way that we can pay, right? I mean, just on wealth taxes, I mean, it's incredible. If you put between like a 2% and a 5% wealth tax on the richest people in the world, you'd have enough money to be able to have a global NHS system, ensure universal social protection, public services. There isn't a question about actually there's not enough money. We only need to look at 16 trillion in COVID responses, 18 trillion in bailing out the banks. There are lots that can be done. We can look to the IMF special drawing rights. I think the story we're saying is not that the poorest people in the global north are going to be hit. I think we have to tell a very, very different story, that it's not for ordinary people, it's not less, it will be better. We have to describe the world that is going to be better, that they've got a place in. Otherwise, we'll never win the social license to make those changes. And that's true. Like, I think the COVID, the reason why I was talking about the WTO and COVID, and actually it goes a little bit to that question you were asking about the Gulf states, right? Because most of the countries in the global south look at what's going on in the WTO and say, if you're not going to lift a TRIPS waiver on the vaccine, which materially affects your citizens, what hope do we have that you're going to allow us the green technology to diversify our economies, to be able to move away from fossil fuels? What answer do you have when we say a country that's only recently found oil or gas, like Uganda, etc., saying you must say no to that, whilst the global north have continued to produce? And it's, often, even in that story, we're all, I mean, I'm no great friend of the Gulf states, of Saudi, of course. We know we fight for democracy and human rights, and we know the relationship between oil and wars and the Gulf War, etc. But it is incredible that people look at the Gulf states and say, oh, them are the baddies, and they are. But the biggest oil producer in the world is the United States. The biggest gas producer in the world is the United States. The country that is expanding more oil and gas is the United States. If you look at the top 10 emitters for accumulated emissions, the Gulf states don't even make those 10. It's US, double that of China, Russia, Germany, the UK with just whatever 1.8% of the population, fifth most responsible, Japan, France, Canada, Poland, etc. And, the UK, even just looking at the UK's fair share, we would be, if we were doing our fair share, we'd be at minus 200% by 2030. Now, we calculated that as War on Want in a study and said that's about $1 trillion in technology and finance. But that finance is not from people's pockets, right? If there's one thing that I think interesting that Ukraine has shown us, is that actually the things that we called for are totally possible. If you can seize the wealth of the oligarchs and shut out Russian companies and seize their assets, why can't you do that of the fossil fuel companies or industrial agribusiness? So there is not a question that there's no money, and it doesn't have to come from ordinary people. There is actually plenty of money. The question is who controls that money.
Continue the panel.
I mean, yeah, you basically said it. But I think that that there's money, and as he had said earlier, there's everything. There's the food, there's there's land, in addition to other things, and things like the military-industrial complex and how much that consumes, at least in terms of about the US, but even here, and the companies that aren't taxed. And I know that there's a global movement which is great around taxation, because it's affecting a lot of countries. So yeah, that's everybody's there, and it's not about the story is really important, and that is also reparations in general, like from the US, reparations for the indigenous people there. If you talk about it in that way, as Asad said, that's not necessary, because it's not for me to do like private owners. The government has enough land that they can give back. So yeah.
Maybe we'll take a question. Hassan, you have your hand.
Thank you. Yes, my name's Hassan. One thing I struggle with sitting here in the global north is you just get a feeling of what the movements are like in the global south. Because I think us in the global north, we're kind of preoccupied with our way of looking at it. And I presume that in the global south, it looks quite different. So what I wanted to know specifically is what is the nature and character of the movements in the global south? How do they develop? What are their demands? And what are, if you like, the different ideas that arise out of those movements? Because I think here we don't really hear those voices at all. And I refuse to think that the global south is just a victim of all this, because I'm sure that there are movements amongst peoples who are throwing up very interesting ideas and demands. I mean, the only one I know of, because it's so huge, was the Indian farmers movement in 2021, because it was so big. And that, as far as I can tell, was characterized by small farmers who were protesting against the laws of the Modi government, who wanted to basically industrialize agriculture and tie the small farmers to big agribusiness and Monsanto, GM foods and stuff like that, GM crops and so on and so forth. So
My question is what are the movements developing in the global south and what are they asking for? Because presumably, actually, although they may think, oh yes, it's a global north to blame, actually, most of the time they must be fighting their own governments and their own vested interests in those countries. They're not necessarily fighting us, as it were. And so that's what I'd like to get a character of, what those movements and what they're asking for and what kind of ideas they're generating.
Thank you. Asad,
Sure. Well, I mean, today is the anniversary of Walter Rodney, the famous Guyanese writer and activist who was assassinated at 38 years old, and he wrote one of the seminal books actually in the 1970s, which was about how the West underdeveloped Africa. And actually, if you read it, it's really telling because it's exactly pertinent to today. I mean, what's really interesting, I find, is, there's a lot of people talk about the climate movements in the global north, and, we all like, oh my God, look, it's amazing, the climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion, etc. But of course, many of the demands were made by anti-colonial movements right in the 60s, 70s. They were saying, we want to control our economies. We want to reorientate our economies to be able to meet the needs of our people. We need public services and health and education. We don't want to be become chattels of the global north in terms of commodity exports, etc. And of course, many of those leaders were either assassinated, countries were overthrown, regimes were overthrown, and we've created a situation where the development pathway for most of the global south is to export commodities, right? Extraction of resources to the north, and then the south buys back the finished product, right? So you don't allow any of that economy to be built. Now, there's real challenges been to that, right? I mean, movement in the global south, I've never seen climate into separation. They've always formulated it as, this is a justice fight. So we have to challenge our own governments about the development pathway. We have to hold the richest countries accountable, because we know that this transition isn't simply about transitioning fossil fuels. It's actually about meeting the needs of people, dignity, and all of those things. And in the global south, as you quite rightly said, whether it's the Indian farmers or in South Africa, one of our partners there is Abishali, which is the shack dwellers movement. And there's an incredible campaign of what they call the Poor People's Campaign, about what they think a justice transition is, about the right to housing and living wages and protection and against extraction, a new model of the economy. If you look at Chile, which was the cradle of neoliberalism and extraction of minerals and metals, it's now the new government has said, well, the cradle of neoliberalism will become the graveyard of neoliberalism. How? Because a mass movement of movements, overthrew that government and said, actually, we want a different Chile. We want a Chile that isn't about simply exporting commodities to the global north. All around the world, our partners, they've got really well thought out frames of the kind of transitions that they want that combine these, whether it's garment workers in the fashion industry in Asia. We're saying, look, the West, progressive people in the West think that the answer is, I won't buy, X clothes because it's carbon intensive and it's terrible. But what about the fact that Bangladesh, 80% of its income relies on the garment sector, and the workers in the garment sector? They're saying, look, we have to have a very, very different transition, one that guarantees us, yes, living wages, but also links the carbon issue, but also links issues in terms of limits of material use. So we work with many around this idea of a radical global Green New Deal, but it has many, many different names. In South America at the moment, there's an incredible work being done on what's called an eco-social pact, on how do you have an alternative form of development that isn't about extraction, but meets people's needs. In Southern Africa, there's eco-feminist transition. In Asia, there's a justice transition network. There is the global south is often seen as, well, these are the people who only resist, right? And they're like, no, we're the people who've got the ideas for the transformation. It's you in the global north who don't even resist and have no ideas for the transformation. You are the ones that simply saying nothing can change. We're showing you that things can change. What we need is movements with the belief, with the hope, with the vision, and the commitment to actually deliver the kind of changes that we know. And then this is not you acting in solidarity with us. This is you doing your bit of this struggle and changing the world. So, you know, there is no shortage of global South movements, and particularly of climate justice movements. In fact, you know, for decades, I would say a good 95% of the climate justice movement was made up primarily of the global South. Climate justice has only been a word in the global North in very, very recent terms. I mean, apart from a few of us who have been in the climate justice movement, the majority of people or organizations working on climate said justice was a luxury, you know, was not a necessity. This was only about cutting carbon. We said you can never cut carbon without cutting injustice. So it's a very different way of looking at the climate crisis. It's been developed in the global South. It's now coming to the global North. And actually, you know, we're a little bit late to this party in the sense of both the alternatives, of the vision, and of the struggle.
Thank you. Once I wanted to come in about the interconnectedness of social justice struggles in India. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for bringing up that example. In India, the environmental movements have been going on for decades. We've seen villages starting what was back in the 70s called the Chippewa Movement, where they were like hugging trees that was going to be cut by like big companies. We've seen protests against dams that submerge entire villages in Gujarat, for example, on the Narmada River. And obviously the dams got built and the villages got flooded, and those villages haven't been compensated yet. Those struggles are ongoing. Probably the biggest multi-decade struggle has been in the forests in central India, where indigenous communities have been fighting against coal mining interests, iron ore mining interests, and they've been absolutely just hammered by the state over several decades. There's a militancy in like the government has sent in special police forces. There's like extra laws that have been implemented just to like allow all sorts of criminal behavior from the state, and all of that is basically challenging this model of development, which the Indian government insisted would help, people in the cities get more electricity or like have access to middle class lifestyles, but all of that has been built on the backs of indigenous communities and rural communities in India. And the farmers' movement was linked to that same struggle as well. In fact, the climate justice as a term itself, one of the most foundational texts that first introduced that concept was in the early 90s by a researcher called Sunitha Narayan, who is still part of the Center for Science and Environment and still does incredible work in India. So I would definitely recommend following that specific organization because they're still doing amazing work in India. So here, as Asad has said, like a lot of this conversation has been driven from the global South, and they are the ones still resisting their own governments against all of the interests that are often again funded by Western companies, mining interests, like other big businesses as well. Thank you.
Sharon, can I just quickly add something on that, if that's okay?
Yeah, very quickly.
Very, very quick. I mean, that's a great example is the question about fossil fuels, right? So in the global North went, take action on climate change. What do you do? Change your light bulb, don't use plastic bags. Then it went to end fossil fuels, right? And then it said, 100% renewables. Well, in the global South, they were saying, hold on a minute, your 100% renewables is a new wave of extraction of minerals and metals, right? It's a new wave of green colonialism. What we should be demanding is actually you in the global North need to reduce your energy by 60% so we can increase our energy because we're not happy with one light bulb and one phone charger. But that means we have to have publicly owned energy, so it's equitably shared. So that demand for like democratically owned energy and equitably shared actually came from the global South. And now we've seen academic experts saying if you have sufficiency, you can provide enough energy for 10 billion people. And that's not just a simple bit of energy. That's enough energy for all of our productive energy, for living wages, social protection, for an economy. But it does mean that excessive consumption of energy in the global North needs to change. And that's a lens that the global North really would not look at in terms of the idea of the growth or unsustainable growth, and that's been challenged by the global south particularly.
Oh, of course.
I'm glad you said that, because I was gonna just say basically the same thing in relation to one of your questions about the financing, and I think I said answered that well about the individual use, but I think that in the global north, people will have to make changes to their lifestyles, because it seems to be this idea that we can, solar panel and our way out of and keep our standards, and that's not anything. So there will have to be some changes, because the extraction of capitalism is definitely happening. It's happening in the US on indigenous lands, and actually in Northern Europe, because the countries, at least some of the Nordic countries with the wind power, with really good looking stats on their mix of renewables are on Sami territory and on indigenous lands, and which is destroying the reindeer habitat and the livelihoods.
Looking for hands, I will go with, is it me? Okay, maybe ask and then we'll see. We have 5 more minutes.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. I hope my question makes sense. I want to very quickly focus internally. This racist capitalism, I quite like this statement that racist capitalism is working quite well. It's very well oiled machine. But if we are to adapt or adopt a global south approach to structural reorganization towards this pluralist approach, where we live in a world where many worlds fit how can we adapt this in the global north? It becomes a critical intervention that we need to create a system.
Sharon, could you just repeat that or paraphrase that? Sorry, it was going low and high and I couldn't quite catch it. I caught racialized capitalism, I didn't catch anything else.
Were you asking if we try to prioritize voices from the global south, what would the transformation be?
If we're trying to get to a paradigm shift and let's say thoughts from one of the global south, where shifting something and we have, let's say, more community approach, let's say, centralized energy, so on. So, can you give us a good example of how we can adapt the model in global north?
Did you get that?
No, it was.
So basically, if we were to adopt models or examples from the global south, what would a world like that look like? Do you have any examples of that having happened successfully?
Examples of it happening successfully. Look, I mean, there are examples, right? I mean, in the sense of they're not. I mean, there are. People point to Bhutan and say, look, here's a country that has put, well-being at the center and not global, not GDP. There have been examples where, like in Latin America with the ALBA countries, there's been an attempt to say, how do you have center Mother Earth, right, and the relationship between that. The challenges, as we know, are that at a nation state level, there is incredible pressure. Are there alternatives? Yes, at a community level and at a local level, there are incredible amount of alternatives. I mean, Indigenous people would say we have always lived in balance, right, in sufficiency, and we've got a different way of having a relationship with the world in which we live in. So it is a paradigm shift, but I think the thing for us, for all of us, is we've got to remember partly how change happens, right? So if you think back to the Russian Revolution, right? Nobody could say what the world they were trying to create because they didn't have an example, but they were able to describe the world and how people fit into it. And they did it in a way that said it's about peace and justice and bread, right? in Asia, we had that, roti kapra makan, right, in the 60s and 70s, right, that it's about housing and food and clothing. There are ways in which you can describe the world which is about better and not less, which I think allows people to begin to see. Is the world we know like easily describable in the sense of like we can give this example? No, but we know that transformations are incredibly fast when they happen. 2.5 years ago, if we'd have sat in this room and said, there will come a time when none of us will leave our homes and we'll all be wearing masks, and none of us will travel, none of us will do it, people would have laughed and said, no way would that ever happen in economies in the global north. And yet it did. So transformation can happen quite swiftly. So I think what we've got to think about more is, what are the building blocks of that? How do we guarantee people energy and food, these social goods like a living wage and social protection, and start to talk about them in a way that people begin to see themselves in? And then that creates the alternatives. And it might be that there's not one alternative, that there are many alternatives. As Arundhati Roy says, it's another world is not just possible, but it's another world will be possible, right? Because what fits in one context will probably not be the right for other regional contexts. So there will be alternatives that are developed that are relevant to each context, but there are fundamental principles that we need to meet that are people's human needs and, of course, living in balance with the planet, which is why we work on this idea of a global Green New Deal.
Thank you. Sandra, I wonder if you wanted to come into that. So your work must involve building relationships and connections with the small world.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned plurality. So from a kind of, let's say, an epistemological perspective, the paradigm shift is really just kind of acknowledging that there are traditional knowledges, there are other centers of innovation or centers where knowledge is produced, in the global south. So that's kind of a paradigm shift, because we think that, usually kind of the big innovations will come from London, from some university in the United States, right? So in my experience, I was recently in a meeting of different campaigners from different African countries, and to present what I just literally said to you, I said to them, saying, "Oh, send me your letters, your stories, and we want to kind of bring them to communities around the UK." And I was just listening to what they were discussing and the amount of knowledge that they had about their countries and issues to do with the history, colonialism. It was astounding. It was really amazed. So there's a lot of, one thing is acknowledging there's a lot of knowledge and expertise and, innovative practices as well as traditional knowledges that, exist all around the world. They are equally valid. So that's one thing. On the other, when you mentioned plurality, for me personally, really the point is that we don't necessarily have to take a model and adapt it to somewhere else. That's, I think, Asad, you mentioned that towards your end of your answer. It's exactly the point that there are many different alternatives and people live differently, and we cannot do like the West has claimed that one model fits all, one model of education exported everywhere, one model of something, again, exported everywhere, and it's the only valid knowledge or valid system or way of doing things that exists. So accepting that is a way to, there's obviously, we can take inspiration from different models and then readapt and then reinvent. And in UK, local communities in the UK, poorer neighborhoods. I was recently involved in a project where they're creating some community co-owned energy in my borough, for example, and it's been applied in different places in the UK. It's worked quite well, so they're trying to implement it in my borough and do some research project on that, and I'm helping out with that. That's a model, and there may be many other models that come. And one of the things that I'm interested in is actually going around and finding out what ideas people have at the local level, at the grassroots level, and how this can kind of, have some impact, policy impact. How can they be, through deliberative, democratic, or participatory practices, established in some way?
in different communities.
Okay, so I'm really sorry, I would like this conversation to continue, but it cannot. It can continue when we have our sustainable. But before that, well, I think this is a nice place to sort of end this, talking about multiple realities and futures that we can create together in solidarity with people from different parts of the world and also next door to us in our boroughs. I think this is a nice place to stop. Before I hand over to Asad to close this event, I wondered if we could maybe take a moment of silence. If you want to, you can offer a silent al-Fatiha. I'd like us to offer a silent al-Fatiha to all the environmental and human rights defenders around the world, many of whom are losing loved ones and their lives and their livelihoods, even now as we are speaking in this space. So let's just take a moment for that. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Amen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Asad. Thank you to our panel.
Thank you so much. My name is Ehsan Masood. I'm the Chair of Trustees at the Muslim Institute, and on behalf of all my colleagues here and all of you, of course, just a few words of thanks. I'm going to keep this really brief. Thank you to Asad Rehman, our keynote speaker, and to Alessandra, to Moiz, to Shumeza, and very expertly chaired, I have to say, Shannon, to you. Huge thanks also to our hosts here, the Art Workers Guild, for we've been coming in for a number of years now, and especially to Elspeth, who must have reached you when you came in. To our caterers for tonight, Made Up Kitchen, and we're going to see how good they are just in a minute. And of course, a ginormous thanks to Samia for pulling it all off this evening. Samia's asked me to say a few things about upcoming events, and I'm just going to rattle through them. Next date in the diary is June 29th, an audience with the Islamic scholar Amina Wadood, and we're doing this in partnership with the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, Kantara Press, which is an imprint of Beacon Books, and that'll be at the Yunus Emre Institute here in London. Following month, between 2nd and 3rd of July, Critical Muslim is organizing events, live events at the Bradford Literature Festival, and if you haven't been there, you haven't lived. You really have to go to the Bradford Literature Festival, and I'm here. Then we take a quick break for summer, and then Critical Muslim are back for a 3-day feast of authors, of ideas, of argument, art, no science, sad. And that's going to be 16 to 18 September, and Samia and Shannon are co-curating. And then finally, just for this year, there's the Institute's Winter Gathering, now in its 11th year, I think. It's in Salisbury, opposite the cathedral. It's a really nice venue, it's a lovely event, and that's going to be 21st to 23rd of October. It's always themed, and this year's theme is going to be Europe. Thank you so much. All of you, give yourselves a round of applause. And let's go eat. Thank you.
Enjoy the food. I'll be there with you in spirit.
Very nice to meet you, Asad.
Me too.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Bye.
End it.
Yeah, I think they've stopped it. Oh no, they haven't.
I think it is. Just end the call.
I'll just pause it and let them figure it out.